You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
In today's episode of the podcast, I speak with ultrarunner Katie Graff. She recently completed the Triple Crown of 200s, which includes the Bigfoot 200, Tahoe 200, and the Moab 240, all within the same year. We talk about these races, and she shares many useful tips. I hope you enjoy. Katie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. So let's just start off with learning a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I actually started running back in my freshman year of high school. I had actually tried out for the basketball team, and I wasn't too fond of the sport. And I saw a sign at the drinking fountain to come join indoor track. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll try that out. And then I just kind of fell in love with it, and some of my teammates encouraged me to join outdoor track. And then I also did cross country. And then when I went to college, I continued running cross country, and I really enjoyed it. I like the camaraderie from being on a team, and I loved running on trails. So the weird thing for me was that I felt like it wasn't enough. 3 miles wasn't enough time for me to really get my speed up, and I sometimes would do like 5-mile warm-ups. And so we also had like a men's course on our campus, and sometimes I would just run the men's course for warm-ups and stuff for our workouts. And it makes a lot more sense to me now because I realize how much I prefer the longer distances.
Yeah, so you seem to get stronger as as it gets longer, right? Yeah.
To some degree, yeah. I think 200 miles is plenty of time, but yeah.
Yeah. We'll get into that. That's a whole different ball game. But so you're now in Austin. Yeah. So, I mean, what's the trail running scene like there? Is it kind of, from a trail and terrain perspective, a good training ground to do things like the Bigfoot and other, we'll talk about those races, but is there enough hills and enough terrain to kind of get the diversity you need to train?
There's some, but I wouldn't say it's ideal. If I want to go run in the mountains, I have to drive about 8 hours.
Oh, wow.
So I did a lot of hill repeats this past spring and summer.
Yeah.
The Greenbelt has a nice hill called Hill of Life, and it's about 300 feet and elevation gain in half a mile. So I would just keep going up and down that a lot.
I'm in New York City, and so I probably an hour drive away. I can get to a decent, quote unquote mountain. It's not really a mountain, but in the city where I live, I do most of my training. So I have a hill that's maybe, I don't know, like 60 to 70 feet, and so I often want to hear about these kind of hill repeat workouts, and how do you get around the monotony of it? I mean, what kind of structure did you use to do these hill repeats?
Well, it was very interesting. When I started working with Jason, he had me do interval work and speed work, which felt very uncomfortable at first. I haven't done speed work in a while. But later he had me doing tempo runs while also doing hill repeats. And so I usually like to negative split my hill repeats, but he just wanted me to keep a very consistent pace. And so that was a little bit different and challenging for me, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Jason isn't really into a lot of downhill running. You end up spending more time going uphill than downhill, and he feels that it's just there's too high risk for injuries. Which on that specific hill I was training on, it's extremely technical, and there are a lot of areas where you have to step down from big rocks.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have been ideal to do a lot of downhill running. Yeah, that was the main hill that I trained on. And I also went out to Colorado. Jason had a camp out there for CTS athletes. And that was like a 3-day thing. So that was really good for me because I got to run in the mountains. And the last day we did a 50K, and it was like 8,000 or 9,000 feet of gain.
Right. Is that the camp he does on Memorial Day weekend in Colorado Springs, or is it? Yeah. Did you get to meet Ryan Lang there? He was on the podcast recently. He did the Moab 240, and he was talking about it. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. So actually, I just saw that yesterday that he did that podcast with you, and I was trying to listen to some of it. It was really cool to see him out there, and he was just so excited. All throughout the summer, he was texting me and just being really supportive and encouraging. And I was trying to give him some tips as well. He's an amazing guy.
Yeah, he's awesome. So let's talk about the, some of your races. So I want to start in 2016. So you ended up doing the Bigfoot 200 in 2016. That's a race that it looks incredible. I mean, the terrain, the view is obviously challenging. Why did you choose that race, and how did it go for you?
I chose that race because I thought it would be the most scenic. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that one or Colorado, and based on the comments I received from like a Facebook thread, it seemed like that would be more scenic and also just a little more challenging with the climbing. I think Bigfoot had a little more climbing. So I chose that one, and I'm really glad I did. Out of the 3 races, it's by far my favorite. And I had a really good experience the first time. It was actually probably my best 200-mile race out of the 4 that I've done.
Right. So, I mean, it had to have gone well enough, or you must have enjoyed it well enough to then go into 2017 and say, hey, I'm going to go for the Triple Crown. And for those who aren't aware, that is the 200-mile races that, Candace Burr puts on. And it starts out at Bigfoot, then Tahoe. Oh, no, actually, is that the right order? Yeah, that Tahoe, and then the Moab 240, which is not really 200, it's 240, so even bigger. Yeah. So, just talk a little bit about that decision. So, to do one 200 is, to me, kind of a big accomplishment, a big bucket list. But then you said, okay, coming back in 2017, I'm going to do all 3. I mean, so how did that thought process happen?
Well, I didn't make the decision until, I think it was January or February, and it was funny because after Bigfoot last year, some of my friends were like, oh yeah, we're going to do Tahoe in 3 weeks, and I just could not even conceive of it. And I ended up doing Franklin Mountains 50K 3 weeks later when they were doing Tahoe, and I was so glad that I was only running like 30 miles because my feet were still pretty numb and beat up. And then something happened in like January or February, and I started thinking like, maybe it is possible, and this would certainly challenge me a lot more. I would be able to learn more about myself and meet other runners and connect with them.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was reading recently. You had an article, I think, in Ultrarunner magazine. I read that you had a list of tips and I was reading through those tips, and one of them, which is something other people on this podcast have said before, which is have a really good reason why you're doing these races. So when you hit kind of a deep dark moment, you can fall back on it and say, yes, I'm doing it for this reason. And, so what was your why, other than, I mean, maybe just finding kind of where your limits are, or, challenging yourself? Did you have, what was your why that you kind of fell back on when things got difficult?
So I felt like there were a few of them. Exploring my limitations was one of them, learning more about myself. I really wanted to know if the 200 is like my most competitive distance. And after doing those 3, I don't think it is, to be honest. I'm not sure. I mean, 2 of the races I was injured, so it's hard to say. But I really enjoy that distance. I just don't think I'm the most competitive at it.
Right.
So I wanted to do that. I wanted to connect with other runners. And I also wanted to feel more emotional lows, which sounds strange, but I feel like I'm a fairly emotionally stable person, and I don't necessarily feel a lot of the negative emotions that people have told me about when they run ultras. So I thought 200 would be a great opportunity to experience some of that, and I certainly did.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're trying to find the limit to where you fall into that abyss, and then I guess battle your way back out of it, which is obviously at the end of the day pretty gratifying and feels like you accomplished something, right?
Yeah, and it sounds weird, but I almost felt like I was missing out on something by not experiencing like a wider range of emotions. And so I wanted to, I guess, feel more alive in a sense.
Yeah. No, I get that. I've have a similar experience with I basically have been doing triathlons for the past number of years, and now I'm sort of transitioning and more focusing on trail running and stuff. But when I crossed the finish line in my first Ironman, I it was a good accomplishment, but I didn't, like, some people told me it was like, oh, it's life-changing. It's, you're going to cry. It's going to be emotional. For me, I just kind of was like, okay, let me go grab some pizza and go back to the hotel. So it was like kind of an emotional letdown for me. So, so I get it, I'm like, what did I miss? So, right. maybe I need to do a 200 to try to ferret out that emotion.
Yeah, there you go.
So I was going to ask, and you've already answered it, but let's explore a little bit why. I was going to ask why, which one of the three was your favorite? You said Bigfoot. So why was that? I mean, just compare a little bit about the three races and then why you specifically kind of gravitate towards Bigfoot. I mean, realizing obviously it's the first one, you were healthy, but what else makes that race the one you really like?
I love all the climbing. I really enjoy climbing, and that race has the most climbing. So and the views, there's some beautiful views of waterfalls about halfway through the race. Yeah, there's just such a variety of terrain too, because you're going through like around St. Helens in the beginning, and then you have some beautiful fields you're running through. You're running up these big mountains. It's just really gorgeous, and I guess it was a little bit nostalgic for me too, because I got to think about all the adventures I had there last year. Yeah. And it was such a good experience for me. So it was fun to reflect on all of that.
Right. And so you say you love climbing. I mean, is that something you've always loved, or something you've developed over time? I'm because some people loathe it. So I'm trying to understand, how did you get to the point where you love it and you actually seek it out?
Well, the area I grew up in, I was in a valley, actually. So wherever I ran, I was running up hills. And one of my coaches once told me to think of hills as opportunities. And I don't know, I think that's just one of my strengths. I really like climbing up hills. And usually if I want to try to pass someone, that's going to be where it's at. And if someone's going to pass me, it's almost always on a downhill.
Right. Right. So, yeah. I mean, for someone who, flatlander person who's got a hill, they can do some repeats and things. I mean, what would be some of the training tips you would have for them in terms of becoming a better climber, both running and, power hiking and, in some of these situations where we're talking about steep, long climbs? I mean, did you do anything specific or different around training that helped? Or, I mean, you already mentioned a little bit about Jason Koop's philosophy, but is there anything else you would mention?
Some of my friends do the tire dragging, and I personally haven't done that, but they said that that's really good training for hills. And I have quite a few friends out in Houston where it's like pancake flat. And so they'll just drag around tires like around Memorial Park. So that's an option. I like to do squats and lunges and try to make sure that I'm trying to strengthen my glutes and hamstrings and quads.
Right. And so, so you mentioned, you alluded to an injury. So can you just talk a little bit about, so then you finish Bigfoot, you go into Tahoe, and it sounds like you were injured. And then obviously I guess you had an injury going into Moab as well. Can you just talk a little bit about that? And then in addition, I guess which race was most challenging? I mean, not necessarily because it's the hardest race, Bigfoot has the most climbing, but you had an injury in these other races. Did that make that more challenging mentally and physically?
That's a good question. I'll start off with the injury. So during Tahoe, I ended up getting tendonitis in the top of my right foot. And at the time, it was pretty swollen and bruised, and the medics thought that it was a stress fracture. And I couldn't push off from my toes. It was a lot of marching. And that race was quite challenging because there were 2 times when I thought I just had to drop and that I wouldn't even meet the time cutoffs based on my pace.
Right.
So it was difficult just going through that emotional process and being accepting of the circumstances. I also had auditory hallucinations for the first time during that race, which really messed with my head. But it only lasted maybe half an hour to an hour. And then I guess Moab would probably be my most challenging race. And with that race, I still had the tendonitis issue, and it wasn't as bad as Tahoe, but it still wasn't ideal. And I did do a lot of marching and power walking.
Right.
And I would say Moab was the most challenging for me because I ran out of water several times.
Oh.
And whenever I would run out of water, then I just wouldn't want to eat because I felt like water was the priority. So I got behind on my nutrition a few times, and it was more like survival mode out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been in situations where I've run out of water and, a few hours in between or something. It is absolutely the worst condition. I mean, all you're thinking about is water and begging for it. But I mean, so a lesson learned there, I guess, is, if you were to go back to Moab, obviously it's a desert, so I guess there's not streams where you can pull water from. But I mean, what would you recommend? Just carrying a larger bladder, or what would you have done differently?
Yeah, so I had a 2-liter bladder, and then I had a 16-ounce bottle. And I am, out of like all my running friends, I'm usually the lightest drinker. So I thought that would be plenty. And I would definitely bring a 3-liter bladder in the future.
Right. And then in the Moab 240, I mean, do you think the 40 miles, made a big difference for you or the other competitors in terms of like, it's interesting because you've got like Bigfoot, which is I think 205, and it's a lot more climbing. In fact, from a mileage perspective, I calculated it was double the climbing as compared to Moab, and then Moab's less climbing, longer mileage. I mean, if I looked at overall times and stuff, it seemed like Moab was a little faster for most people. But I mean, did you feel like the 40 miles made a difference mentally for you? I mean, obviously you were dealing with additional issues, but did you get to 200 and you're like, wait a second, I've done 2 of these before and I still have, 40 more miles to go in this race? This is crazy.
No, I tried to make it a point to not think about my mileage. I just focused on aid station to aid station, and I was kind of just counting down the aid stations, to be honest. But I knew going into this that I would probably be out there 4 nights. And for Tahoe, I had hoped that I could have run to under 80 hours, and because of the injury that didn't happen. So it was a big surprise for me to have to spend a 4th night out there. But I tried to think of it positively, and I was like, well, this will be good practice for Moab. And it was, because I knew what it was like to spend 4 nights out there, and it wasn't ideal, but actually the 4th night was the best night for me. My friend and pacer, Sean, and I ended up singing Christmas carols at like 2 a.m. and 80 songs, and we kept ourselves pretty distracted and occupied.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was actually on, what'd you say?
I said that's awesome, singing some 80s tunes and things.
Yeah, it actually went by really quickly, and we had done like the most technical section of the course was on the Porcupine Trail, so just a lot of big rocks and stepping down, but I don't remember that section being that challenging, probably because we were singing Christmas songs.
Yeah.
But it was, that 4th night was really fun.
Right. And you mentioned, I want to step back to Tahoe for a second, and you mentioned that you were really struggling. You were at points didn't even know if you were going to finish or going to quit. I read one of the tips that you mentioned in your list of tips is to sleep a little bit, take a nap before quitting, just to see if kind of you can hit that reset mode. Was that a strategy you used during the races to say, oh, I don't want to go on any further? You go to sleep, take a 20-minute nap, and you wake up and you feel better? Yeah.
In fact, the 2nd night, it got down to 10 degrees in Moab, and I was pretty set on dropping. I was extremely stressed out and just emotionally drained, and I could not foresee how my body could tolerate that for another 2 nights. So I was pretty upset, and by the time I got to the aid station, I had told Jason that I couldn't do another night like this, and I was really concerned about disappointing a lot of people. So even though I knew I wanted to drop, I couldn't just tell people I was going to drop, and I didn't go to the aid station volunteers and let them know. I just took a nap. Actually, it was like a 2.5-hour nap. It was my longest one. But when I woke up, I did feel a lot better, and I told Jason and Sean that I was willing to do the next section, but I still wasn't going to spend another 2 nights out here. But I later found out the next 2 nights was going to be like 40, and so they were much warmer.
Right. And so, I mean, was it a case where, and you're not the only one who've mentioned this. I think everyone I've talked about Moab has talked about how, or everyone I've listened to in different interviews and things talked about how cold it got. I mean, was that just sort of a surprise for everyone, or in terms of like the gear that you all brought, or is it just sort of at the end of the day, there's only so many things you could bring and put into a drop bag, and you just didn't, in other words, would you plan differently for it for someone who's doing the race next year? Would you recommend more cold weather gear in drop bags, things like that?
Yeah, I definitely would recommend people bring a lot of cold weather gear. I don't feel like I could have done anything differently to better prepare for that other than not be injured and be able to move faster, because I had those stick-on heating patches. I had those all over my body. I had 4 layers on, including a down coat. I had hand warmers, tights. So I had everything. I just couldn't move fast enough, and I just kept getting cold.
Yeah. Yeah, I've used those heat pads myself. Actually, I was in a race one time, and I had a couple in my, because I sometimes get a tight back, so I had one in me, and it started raining and it was really cold, and I put it on my back, and it kept me warm. It was a miracle. So when I saw that you mentioned that tip, I was like, that's a really good tip to have, and put those into drop bags or whatever, because it works. Yeah,
I really like those. Someone recommended I use those for Tahoe, and I'm really glad I had those.
Yeah.
But also another thing too is putting warm water in your bladder. That was nice.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good
I didn't do that until the third night. Yeah. So that was good. Yeah, I think I would have also been able to move faster if I didn't feel that sleep deprived. Like I kept falling asleep while we were trying to walk. And so I ended up taking like 4 naps during that section.
Right. So yeah, I mean, talk to me a little bit about, like, I guess, ideal strategy. I mean, of course, if you have an injury or something, or I don't know if the sleep deprivation gets in the way, but there's a sort of balance at these 200s, which is pace and not going too fast and blowing up, and then going too slow and having to be out there for 4 nights or whatever, and having sleep deprivation, that kind of thing. I mean, how would you recommend someone balance that? I mean, what would be, I know everyone's different, but what do you think would be the best sleep strategy in terms of trying to get that right, so you're sort of, I guess, somewhere in the middle, unless of course you're trying to win the race, but that's a whole different breed of people.
Difficult to say. I mean, if I'm ever at a point where I'm, running along and I'm breathing pretty hard, that's usually a pretty good indicator that I'm probably going too fast.
Yeah.
During Tahoe, though, there were a lot of runnable sections, and I was able to go 10, 11-minute mile pace for some of those sections, and that felt comfortable to me. But yeah, I mean, I would say start off really conservatively, because you'll have days to make up time, and if you want to make a move, then I would try to do it at least after you're halfway through. Even then, you still have 100 miles.
Good point.
So I tend to be more of a conservative runner, and I like to finish really strong as I can.
Yeah.
But everyone has their different preferences. I just would say, if you want to start off fast and that's your style, then maybe taking a nap earlier on would be better, so that you can get up and keep on going at that pace. But this you're out there for days, so you'll have a lot of time to make up. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking of sleep, and you mentioned that there were times, I guess, in Moab and maybe some of these others that you needed to take naps between aid stations. So talk a little bit about that. I mean, sleeping on the side of a trail. I mean, what do you do to do that? I mean, are you taking out something so you're warm, and, are you with a pacer? Are you setting an alarm? Are you worried about animals? Just talk a little bit about kind of how you approach that.
Yeah. For Bigfoot and Tahoe, I took most of my naps on the side of the trail, and I just had a bivy sack with me, and I always had warm layers on me, so I would put those on if I needed to. But I just preferred that, because I feel like sometimes the aid stations can be a little bit loud with the generators.
Yeah.
And you have runners coming in and out, so you can bring earplugs. I would recommend that as well. But sometimes I just got better sleep on the side of the trail. And I couldn't predict when I would be too tired to keep moving. So it was just nice to have that option. And for Moab, I also made this eye mask. So I could use that, and I had this little piece of felt that I sewed onto it, and I would put lavender oil on it. So it would help me fall asleep quicker.
Oh, cool. And did you do anything to make sure you didn't sleep too long, or did you just wake up when you woke up? Yeah.
Oh, no, I definitely would set alarms, or if my PA was with me, they would just tell me I'll wake you up in like 10 minutes. Most of my naps are like 10 or 15 minutes.
Right.
So I felt like that was sufficient to kind of give my body a reset.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of one of those things too. I mean, you mentioned you had some longer sleeps as well, but I feel like too long of a sleep and your body starts to get stiff, I would be afraid that I wouldn't be able to move afterwards. But maybe that's just my body, but it's just sort of like, I would be worried about cooling down too much. And so, 15, 20 minutes sounds ideal.
Yeah. And I will mention too, I've heard a couple stories now of people taking, trail naps, and then they'll get up and they'll end up going the wrong way. So some people have,
that'd be,
putting a stick with some arrows to make sure that you know which way to go.
Yeah, that would be the worst. That would be absolute disaster. You get back to the previous aid station or something. That would be a total disaster.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned animals. Are you ever concerned about anything coming up to you? I'm a city person, so I often think about of course I'm going to sleep if I'm exhausted. I'm going to do it, but it's definitely a little bit different on the side of a trail.
No, I didn't really think about that, but I will say during Tahoe, there were a couple sightings of bears and cubs and also a cougar. I didn't personally see it, but it was actually right ahead of us. I don't know. For some reason, I don't think about that. And during Moab, a lot of people were concerned about tarantulas and scorpions.
Yeah.
So I also didn't. I tried not to think about it. I was just like, I just have to focus on getting my sleep and not think about what I can't control.
Yeah, I get a good strategy. I'd be terrified of those things, but yeah. No, I hear you. So, I'm curious. I don't want to get into too many details on your training because I know it's a long topic or whatever. But one of the things that I'm trying to learn as I talk to people doing these 200-mile races is sort of how you're training for this time on your feet. I mean, it's one thing to do a 100-miler or whatever, but this is double and in some cases 240. I mean, how did you train to get enough time on your feet to get into these races where, at some point I'm sure you were in a lot of pain, but it seems to me that that'd be one of the most difficult things is just being on your feet for that long.
It is challenging. I think it depends on your preferences. So I met some runners who were doing the triple and they were doing 40 miles a week. And then I've met some people who prefer higher mileage. So I think on average I ran between like 80 to 110 miles a week. And that worked well for me. I think for others, though, people just prefer lower mileage and they can, still perform just as well. I would say fast packing is a great way to get more time on your feet and to train for the 200s.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
you can do that on a weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So, we're almost out of time, so I have two more questions and then we'll be done. But one is,
okay.
Just any other kind of tips that you would offer up. I mean, we've covered a lot of different things, but someone who's looking at, let's just say, they want to do not the Triple Crown, that's in a class of its own, but let's say someone wants to do just one of these races. Anything else we haven't covered that you'd say is an essential tip that they should be focused on or you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the most important things is just like knowing why you're doing it, and making sure that you have that motivation. And I mean, you're going to question that a lot, not just during the race, but while you're training. And you're going to have a lot of long runs, and it's good to know why you're out there. And I would also try to focus more too on like different mental techniques and trying to increase your mental fortitude and maybe even read some books on mental techniques and mental training. I found that was really helpful for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that people realize like how mental it is to do a 200. I think a lot of people focus on like the physical part, and it's difficult to conceive of that and figure out like how would my body do that. But I think a lot, like 90% of it or more, is mental.
Right. And you mentioned, and I've heard this from other people as well, that you sort of focused on one aid station to another. I mean, a lot of that's mental, right? Not getting overwhelmed by the bigger picture, which is 200 or 240 miles, whatever. I mean, you were able at all times to be able to just stay in that mode and not think about the the enormity of the distance.
Well, not always. I mean, I definitely struggled with it at times. And at one point, like on Sunday during Moab, I found out that Courtney was at mile 220. And I don't even know what mile I was at, but I knew that I still had like 2 more nights out there.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh my gosh. But yeah, I was just like, I just need to focus on this next aid station. And there were definitely times when I was just like, oh my gosh, like I still have like 100 miles to run. And I think it's just important, to go back to, okay, like I just have a couple more miles to this aid station.
Yeah. Just compartmentalize it and don't get overwhelmed by it, which is easier said than done, of course. But so as I said, just one more question, which is sort of what's next. So you've now accomplished 2 amazing feats, right? You've done the Bigfoot 200 in itself in 2016, which is in itself to me a bucket list item, and then you come back in 2017 and do the Triple Crown of 200s, which is raising the stakes again. So what else are you looking at? Are you going to raise the stakes again in some way, or, are you content?
Well, I'm not quite sure yet. I did put in for Hard Rock, but it's unlikely I'll get in. I would like to try out some stage races. I've never done that before, and a couple of my friends have recommended a few overseas. And so I want to do some research on that and figure out if I want to try out some stage races. And I also haven't run a 12-hour event. I've done a 6 and a 24, but I just want to see what the 12 hours like. So I'll do that. And also, I would like to do a lot of pacing next year and try to, pay it forward. I had a lot of really supportive people out there helping me for the triple. And one of them, Jeremy, paced me 122 miles during Bigfoot.
Wow.
So he said if he's not going to get into Hard Rock, he'll do Bigfoot. And I would like to help support him if he does decide to do that.
That's awesome. I guess I lied. Let me ask one more question. In these 200-mile races, just talk to me just really briefly. I want to respect your time, but how important the pacer is and the crew in terms of keeping that mental sanity.
For me, it was really important, and I don't know that I would finish the triple without them. I just had some pretty intense lows, and they were able to encourage me to keep going or to take a nap. And during Bigfoot, I ended up getting hypothermia near the end of the race. It was like mile 160 or 70. So Jeremy was really helpful with, getting me in my bivy sack, putting more layers on me. I was really struggling with that, but and another runner, Noelle, helped out too.
Right. So how did you know who the right people are to be your pacers and crew in terms of personalities? That's one thing I've often thought about is they need to know you. They need to be the right kind of temperament, that kind of thing. It's not always easy. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I didn't think about that until around Tahoe. And I was talking to my coach about a runner, Jason, and he also helped me out at Tahoe, but he brought up the personality thing. And I was like, I never really thought about that. And I just have been really fortunate. When I ran Bigfoot last year, my friend Derek came out and helped me. And I hadn't met him. We just met through that pacer list. But he also paced me for exactly 122 miles. And we just got along really well. We're both therapists. And Jeremy's an engineer, and we just had similar senses of humor. And I've been really fortunate with that working out.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Katie, I think I've had 5 or 6 last questions I've asked you, so I'm gonna. That's actually a good sign because I'm really enjoying picking your brain. So thank you so much for your time. Obviously, congratulations on the Triple Crown. It's an amazing accomplishment, and I can go on forever with questions. So maybe you should write a book about it or something, because that article in Ultrarunner magazine was awesome. It had a lot of good tips. I'll put a link to it on my blog post when I publish this. But thank you for not only sharing your adventures but also giving all these tips. I think it's really helpful and appreciated.
Yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer them.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.